Hello and welcome to my channel, and Happy New Year to everybody. This drawing of a cheetah was done in graphite pencil and colored pencil on sanded paper, and you may think it's a little bit unusual to use colored pencils to do a black and white drawing, but I wanted to use some grays here. So it's a slightly different approach. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe and give me a like. And if you want to see longer videos and more content, you should check out my Patreon. Now let's see how it was done. So a few more words about the pencils I'm using. The graphite pencils I'm going to use are Faber-Castell matte graphite pencils. They're a little bit darker than regular graphite pencils anyway, but on this sanded surface they're going to be even more matte. In addition to them, I'm also going to use Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, mostly black and white, or rather just white and some grays, because I already have these graphite pencils for the black tones, or the darker tones, I suppose. Initially I wanted to use just the graphite pencils and the white pencil, but I changed my mind. So here I'm just sort of modifying the shape of the animal a little bit, because one of the things that often happens to me when I draw cheetahs is that maybe they end up looking a little bit more muscular and robust than they actually are in real life. So I think my sketch may be a little bit off, but I'll try to make some adjustments as I go along. Anyway, as for the surface I'm working on, it's a 1000 grit sandpaper. It's kind of like a mid-tone grey, so it's perfect for what I'm trying to do here. And it's a very nice textured surface that's going to allow me to build up layers and to work both from light to dark and from dark to light, which is very useful when you need to draw very detailed subjects such as this one. I started with the ear on the left. I laid down some of the darker lines first for the darker hair, the darker parts of the fur on the ear, and then I used a little bit of the white colored pencil. So I'm going to be combining these two, and you will see soon enough that I'll be able to put lighter marks on top of the darker ones without any problems, because that's what this sanded surface allows me to do. As for these graphite pencils, like I said, the Faber-Castell Pit Graphite matte pencils are much darker or more matte than conventional graphite pencils, but on this surface especially, they are so matte that they're just like a black colored pencil, so I don't even need to use a black colored pencil. Now I have a couple of different grades of these matte graphite pencils. Some of them are a little bit darker than the others, but you can barely tell the difference. The darkest one I have is a 14B, and for most of the hair I used a 10B most of the time. I used a 10B, 8B, 14B and some others, but I have noticed that if I try to use the lighter ones like an HB or a 2B, they look kind of like a light grey on this surface for some reason. So here I started working on the background, and I didn't want to leave the background this plain grey. I didn't really like it. I wanted to create some depth there and some suggestions of some shapes maybe, but I wanted an out of focus bokeh background with no specific shapes. So first I introduced some light tones and some darker tones here and there just to imitate that out of focus background. But later, as you will see, I wasn't really happy with the amount of value in the background, and I wasn't really happy with the amount of depth that I was achieving, so I'm just going to make it a bit darker a bit later. So here I'm still working on the foliage and adding these lighter marks in the top part of the cheetah's head, and on this side I used for the lighter fur I used white colored pencil for the most part, because the light fur on this side is going to be much lighter than on the right side. So my light source, as you will see, is coming from the left, which means that the left side of the head is going to appear a little bit lighter, and the right side is going to be darker, and there's going to be some shadows there. There's not going to be a huge contrast, but there will be a slight contrast in value between the light side and the shadow side. Around the edge you can see these slightly longer clumps of fur, and I drew them in such a way to create these pointed clumps, pointed groups of fur, so that they look more natural, because you won't have individual hairs flying around. They mostly form small clumps like these and are pointing outwards, I suppose. I'm drawing the eye now, and I'm trying to position the pupil so that I can do that first, because that's going to be one of the darkest details here, although I'm going to have plenty of dark details. And then I'm going to have some reflections in the eye, some catch lights there. Those are going to be done with a lighter pencil. Now, because of this sanded surface, I can put those lighter marks later on top of the darker ones, but if I can put them in advance, I'm going to do it that way, because I want to avoid or minimize the muddying. So I'm pretty sure it would work even if I put it on top of the dark value, but why would I do it if I know where I'm going to place the catch light? Why not just make it as bright or as clean as I can? On this area here under the eye, there's also a little bit of lighter fur. So around the eye we have this darker skin that's kind of extending onto the tear duct, which is then extending into the darker fur, almost like a line going from the tear duct area to the nose and the mouth area. And then here already we have some smaller spots. There's going to be a lot of these spots because we are drawing a cheetah after all. And then I'm just modifying the appearance of the eye a little bit, because I wanted the eye to look very kind of glossy and round. On the top of the head I'm going to draw some of these larger spots, darker spots, and I'm going to draw more of these clumps of fur on the top of the neck area and the head area, and they're kind of pointing upwards a little bit. They're almost a little bit spiky, but I like them that way. So I'm going to try to capture that in my drawing as well. And one of the things that I like to do when I draw these wild cats, these big cats like tigers and leopards and cheetahs, I like to draw these spots first and then do on the rest of the fur, and then do the work on the rest of the fur. That really helps me navigate through the rest of the drawing when I position these spots, and it helps me gauge how much value I need in various parts of the animal's fur. Now, I don't really draw any of these spots when I do the initial sketch. When I do the initial sketch, I just try to get the overall shape of the head to look right, and to get the position of the eye and the distance between the eyes to be more or less correct. But once I'm pretty happy with that, I just start working on other things, and then when I position those or where I place those spots, then it's easier for me to draw the fur in between them. Now here on the left side of the head, I'm still drawing some lighter fur, mostly using a white colored pencil, because the fur is a lot lighter here plus it's facing the light source. And here on the top of the head and the neck, we're going to have a combination of lighter fur and darker fur, but before I get there I still have a lot of work to do in this forehead area, so that's what I'm going to focus on for now. And here I switched to a grey colored pencil. This is a very light grey, so I'm going to be using several greys, or actually 3 greys. One of them is a mid-tone grey that is very similar, kind of like a warm grey, very similar to the background color of my paper. It's almost the same, maybe just a little bit lighter. Then I have a slightly lighter grey, and then I have this one that I'm using now. This is the lightest grey that I have. This light grey is kind of like an off-white, just a little bit darker than white. But I still need it because for example, in that part of the forehead area which I just finished, the fur in real life is probably a little bit ochre or something, so a bit darker than white, so I needed something darker than white. Here I decided to make the background a bit darker. I started laying down some value with a 10B and filling in the background, and then of course once I was happy with the amount of background, with the amount of value, I did a lot of blending. So I didn't do this entirely randomly because I deliberately wanted some parts of the background to be a bit darker than the others, because I can use that to enhance the contrast. So these darker values in the background, they can also help you create an illusion of depth and suggest maybe some shapes in the background. But they can also help you enhance the contrast and draw the focus of the viewer towards the parts of the portrait that you want to draw the focus to. So in this case I want the viewer to focus on the eyes and the middle part of the head mostly. And there's going to be some contrast there. There's going to be some contrast around the snout and the whiskers. I need a darker background so that these whiskers would stand out against the darker background. But on the other side, around the neck area and the back and around the chest area, maybe I'm going to reduce the contrast a little bit because I don't want to draw as much focus to that part of the body. So I want the focus to be on the head. The nose is fairly dark here. I can barely see any details, so I'm just going to cover it with a 14B and leave it like that, and then just focus on the fur. The mouth area and the gums here are also very dark. The only thing that I need to worry about is getting the shape right, because the thing is that when you're drawing animals you don't really have as much pressure as when you're drawing people to get the likeness. But the thing is that you still want it to look like the animal that you're drawing. So in this case I'm drawing a cheetah, and they do vary a little bit in terms of their size and build and all of these things, but a cheetah is still a cheetah and a leopard is a leopard. So you don't want to make a cheetah look like a leopard, and leopards, they generally have wider, more robust heads and jaws, so that's what I'm going to try to capture here. Now I'm drawing these whiskers, and it's a good idea to draw these in a single stroke, but that can be a little bit difficult to do when you have to do curved strokes. And also another thing that's making my job a little bit more difficult is the fact that I'm trying not to rotate the paper, because I'm recording top down, and when I'm recording I generally rotate the drawing a lot less than I normally do when I work off camera. But because I wanted to show you this, I didn't want to rotate as much, and maybe some of the whiskers aren't perfect, but maybe it's better that way. Maybe that's the way it's supposed to look. Anyway, I did those on the left with a white colored pencil. The ones in the shadow side on the right, on the other side of the nose and the mouth, those are probably going to be done in grey colored pencil, so I will want those to stand out, but they will need to be darker because everything in the shadow side is a bit darker than on the light side. Here on the nose, the fur is very short. Now I should probably say a few words about drawing fur, because two things that I always stress when drawing fur, whether you're using charcoal or graphite, doesn't really matter, or colored pencils in this case, is that if you want to get the fur to look right, in addition to the general shading and establishing the relationships between the lighter and darker areas and all that, you need to try to create a realistic looking texture of the fur that looks like the actual animal, and to do that you have to pay attention to the length of the fur and the direction of the fur. So if you look at the cat's head or this cheetah's head, you will see that the length of the hair, the length of the fur varies greatly depending on the part of the face, the part of the head. On the nose it's very short, and around the eyes it gets a little bit longer, and then you will see around the neck and the chest area it gets even longer, obviously. So in order to capture that, you have to make sure that your marks, your strokes, match the length of the fur. You have to match the length of the fur with the length of your strokes, and you also have to match the direction of the fur with the direction of your strokes. And if you keep those two things in mind, most of the time when you're drawing fur, you will actually end up with a very nice looking, very realistic looking fur. Another thing that we can do here, because of this textured surface, is we can layer lighter and darker marks to create more of a layered look of the fur, to create more depth. And to achieve that you have to layer, or you can layer, lighter marks on top of the darker ones. This is the advantage of this textured surface. On regular paper, if I were working in charcoal or graphite for example, I will try to create the impression of that fur using first these darker marks and maybe then pulling some lighter marks with an eraser if I can. I would try to clean up some of these lighter marks, finer marks with a Tombow Mono Zero eraser, or maybe even with a kneaded eraser. It depends on what I'm trying to do, but I will try to pull some highlights on top of the texture of the fur I've already created, but it will be a bit more difficult than here. But I would still try to create more of a layered look, because that creates depth in the fur. It makes it look more three-dimensional. Here on the sanded surface it's a lot easier to do, because I can just put the darker marks first and then layer lighter and lighter marks on top of them. Now moving on to the other eye here, and using the similar approach that I did on the one on the left, just drawing out the shape first and the outline first, positioning these darker areas first, the dark skin around the eye, the pupil, and then just planning ahead where I will put the highlights. So back to what I was saying about the fur, because there's still a few more things to say about this short fur. I tried to make it look as short as possible, and sometimes you will use short marks, sometimes you will even use dots to create an illusion of that short fur. Sometimes you will just drag your pencil and allow it to create a fine texture, because that can also help a little bit. Because when you pull or when you drag a pencil over the surface of the paper, it always creates a little bit of texture randomly, and you can use that to your advantage. You don't have to blend all of it. So here on the nose area the fur is a little bit darker, which is why I used some grays and some black, but I used some lighter marks as well. On the bottom of the jaw area, which I just did, the fur is lighter, but it's big because it's in the shadow, because it's facing away from the light source. I had to use a slightly darker gray. So now I'm positioning those lighter details in the eye, those small catch lights, the small reflections, and then I'm just gonna do the rest of the iris, and I like to use a bit of blending when I do this to create these softer transitions so that it looks more like an actual eye. And for that I'm using a Tutillion. For blending I used so far I used brushes and Tutillions, and here and there I even used my fingers on the background, because on this surface you can also use your fingers if you don't mind the rough surface, but the reason why you can use your fingers is because it's easier to move the material, because the rough surface grinds on the pencils and leaves a little bit of residue that you can move around, so you can use it for blending. So now I'm starting to work on the right side of the face, adding more of these dark spots and making the mouth area also a little bit darker. Like I said, I don't want to make it look too wide, so I still want to make the animal look like a cheetah, because they don't have huge jaws. They're more of a slender looking animal, and that's one of the things I always worry about when drawing cheetahs. This one, the one that I used for reference, appears a little bit more muscular, but I still have to be careful not to make it look like a leopard, I suppose. I'm working on the other side of the face here, and there is patch of darker fur going down the middle, almost like a line dividing the left side and the right side of the face. So it's maybe just a combination of, or rather a group of small spots connected into one shape. Or maybe it's also, there's also a bit of shadow there because I don't know, maybe there's like a dip in the skull going down the middle or something. I don't really understand the anatomy that well, but I'm just trying to interpret what I see. And also this part of the snout here on the right side is a little bit darker, so even though this fur here is lighter, I'm still using slightly darker grays than I did on the left side, because I need to retain that contrast between the light side and the shadow side, and I'm going to try to stay consistent with that throughout the drawing process. So even though, for example, we have lighter fur in a certain part of the face, if that part of the head is in the shadow, it needs to be darker. Everything in the shadow needs to be darker than on the light side of the head. So that's something to keep in mind. You always have to understand how the object interacts with the light source. So I'm just refining the fur in this, let's say, forehead area, and paying attention to not just the color of the fur or the value of the fur, but also the length of the fur, making sure that I'm getting the right texture, and just modifying the shape of those whiskers a little bit, and then moving on with the rest of these darker spots on the fur on the right side of the forehead area. So a few more words about this surface that I'm working on. It's a 1000 grit sanded paper, and it, like I said, it works great with colored pencils. You can also use other pencils on it. You can use pastels, etc. And they're very cheap. It's a very cheap paper that you can buy in a hardware store. But if you want to buy artist quality paper, then maybe you should look and achieve something that kind of looks like this. Then maybe you should look for something better or more expensive, like Pastel Matte or UArt, etc. I can't really find those here where I live, and they're probably a little bit too expensive. But I think this 1000 grit wet to dry sandpaper is a great alternative for me. and it works really well with these detailed subjects where I have to layer a lot of lighter marks on top of the darker ones when I draw fur and things like that. So I've already done many drawings on this surface and I'm pretty happy with it. So I did the other ear, and I'm also drawing some of the larger spots on the other side, on the other side of the body, on the neck. And I just want to position those first so that I could work in between them. But there's going to the part of the body behind the head, the neck area and the upper back area is going to be a lot different than the middle part of the portrait that I just did, because it's going to be slightly out of focus, you see, because the face is the focus. There's a lot more contrast and texture there, so we can see the details very, very clear. And with the neck and the back in the upper right corner, everything gets kind of softer and a little bit out of focus. So I'm going to want to create a bit less texture there, and it's also going to be a bit darker because the fur on the head is lighter, and also because it's closer to the light source. So there's going to be a bit of a transition between the head, which is a bit lighter and more textured, and the neck and the upper back area, which is going to be a bit darker, a bit softer, and a bit out of focus. So I'm going to try to create that transition so that I could maybe draw focus to the cheetah's head. But right now I'm still working on the area above the eyes and sort of making some adjustments on both sides of the head. Here I used a bit more of the white colored pencil, even though it's in the shadow side of the face, but because these cheetah's eyes are kind of bulging out, that ridge above the eye is sticking out and catching more light from the light source, and it's covered with lighter fur, so I had to use a little bit of lighter gray and even some white colored pencil for it. And I'm just doing a bit more work on this area around the ear and trying to figure out how to make that transition between the head and the neck. For softening some of these marks, I can use Tortillons. I always use multiple Tortillons when I work in colored pencils because I want some of them, I don't want them to muddy the marks too much, so I use one for the lightest colors, for the lighter colors, one for the darker colors. Here I use 2 Tortillons only because it's just sort of black and white. When I draw these patches, initially I just don't worry about the exact shape too much. Later I refine their shape and texture a little bit. So now I decided to go in between these spots and to add some indications of the direction and the texture of the fur using a graphite pencil. The reason why I did that rather than using a gray pencil is because this part of the fur appears darker, and if I used lighter gray, maybe it would appear a little bit too light. And if I use the mid-tone gray, it's pretty much the same as the background color of the paper. So I just used some graphite pencil, which is a bit darker, and then softened that, or kept softening that with a brush to get the proper texture. And maybe later I added a few touches with a lighter gray just to give it a little bit more depth and make it a bit more three-dimensional. So that was my approach here. After that I moved on to the rest of the fur on the right side of the head, drawing more and more of these darker spots, but these are quite a bit smaller, so I need to be a little bit more careful about where I put them. On this side of the forehead and the temple area, the fur gets a little bit darker, so it's probably a little more yellowish and ochre in real life, so it's not white or light yellow. So I just decided to put down a little bit of graphite pencil first to establish a slightly darker tone and darker texture, and then I decided to work on top of that with a light gray. But the light gray that I'm going to use here on this right side, the shadow side, is still going to be a bit darker than the light gray I used on the light side of the face. And by pulling those lighter marks on top of the darker area which I already shaded, I was able to create a very nice looking texture. As you can see, you can play around with width and the direction of your strokes a little bit, because you want a little bit of variation. You don't want the fur to look, or the hair to look too uniform. You don't want to just draw parallel marks. You want to make it look a bit more natural, I suppose. And I just worked in between those spots and on top of the darker marks, and kept using the same approach for the right side of the face. Here I'm continuing with this part of under the eye where there's a little bit of lighter fur, and I had to go in with a very light gray there, even though it's the shadow side, I suppose. But that part of the eye socket area is kind of getting a little bit more light, plus it's covered with lighter fur, so I need to make it a bit lighter. But here, this cheek area, which is kind of sunken in, is a bit darker, so I'm going to use a bit more value there, a bit more of a graphite pencil, and then a bit less of a light grey pencil, I suppose. If I feel like the texture is too much, I can always soften it a little bit with a brush or tortillon, depending on what I'm trying to achieve or how much precision I need. But it works really well on this surface. As for the lower part of the jaw, I can't really touch that just yet, because to finish those lighter hairs and those whiskers on the other side, I would first need to do the rest of the background under the animal's head, and I'm not ready to do that just yet because I still have a lot of work to do on the right side of the head to get the texture to look right. Some parts of this drawing process can be a little bit tedious because you're just drawing the fur, but I skipped over some of them, and at one point I even forgot to turn on my camera, so if I don't record everything, I'm sorry. Plus it's a slightly shorter video here on YouTube, but if you want to see longer videos and real-time footage, like I said, you can always check out my Patreon. Here, as you can see, I did the background on the lower part of the drawing, where I again used a bit of darker value to create more contrast. And now I'm just gonna finish the work on this lower jaw and pull some of these fine longer hairs, as well as the rest of the whiskers, I suppose. I need to be careful with this because I don't want the jaw to look a little bit too big and too robust. Cheetahs have smaller jaws, and later you will see me kind of trimming the hair on that part of the jaw a little bit to make the jaw appear a little bit smaller. So I pulled these whiskers on the right side using a slightly darker grey here, because these whiskers, even though they're white, they're still in the shadow, so they're not going to be as light as the whiskers on the left side. And once I did that, I was ready to move on with the rest of the body. This is going to be a little bit faster now because by far the most complex part of the drawing process is over. I'm just going to be making some adjustments to the texture of the fur and the shape of the animal's head. But this part of the body, the neck and the back and the chest area, that's going to be pretty quick. I just draw these darker spots. I know their shape is a little bit ugly at first, but I can always refine it a little bit so that I can make it look more like actual fur, like a group of darker hairs. And I can do that by adding a few more marks around them, modifying their shape and adding some lighter marks on top of them, like there are maybe some bits of that lighter fur growing over them, and that makes it look more like actual fur rather than just spots painted on the animal's body. I also modified the shape of the ear on the right a little bit because I didn't like it, so I made some adjustments there, and then I made some adjustments to the texture of the fur on the top of the animal's body. You can see how much softer and out of focus that looks, but it also looks longer, and I want it that way because I feel like the fur on the cheetah's head, especially on the nose and around the eyes, is a lot shorter, and it feels like it's more coarse. Here on the rest of the body it feels like it's longer and fluffier, so I'm trying to create that look, and I'm just preparing the work for the texture by putting down some marks with a graphite pencil first, and then just working on top of that with a brush to soften that, and then putting some grey marks to refine the texture and to create a bit more depth. I did some work with this middle grey, even though it's more or less the same color as the background color of my paper, but it helps when you put the darker layers first, and then you put this middle grey on top, and then you put in even lighter grey sparingly here and there, just to give it even more range of value and even more depth, to create a more three-dimensional looking fur. The drawing is almost done. As you can see, I'm making some final adjustments on this transition between the head and the neck, because I'm trying to figure out the exact shape of the head. I'm making some overall adjustments to the shape of the animal's head and the body to make it look more like an actual cheetah, and also refining the texture of the fur here and there, I suppose. But these are just some finishing touches. Sometimes I end the drawing process a little bit earlier, sometimes I spend a little bit more time refining it. It depends on how I feel. I rotated the drawing here just to put down some finishing touches on the top of the head here. Like I said, I try to minimize the rotating because I'm recording, and I know that it would make it difficult for you to watch, but it really is a lot easier when you can rotate the drawing a little bit, because that helps you work from different angles where it's a lot more comfortable for you. The drawing is now almost finished. I'm just going to put my signature here in the lower left corner, and I used a light grey for that. And after a few minor adjustments on the neck area, I'm pretty much done with the drawing process, and this is what it looks like. I hope you enjoyed the video and found some of it useful or entertaining. Once again, if you like the video, don't forget to give me a like and subscribe. Check out my other videos, and if you want to see longer videos and more content, don't forget to check out my Patreon. I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.